The following program is a collaboration between the Council on Social Work Education and the National Association of Social Workers. Financial support was provided by the Brown Foundation of Houston, Texas. From the dawn of civilization, the plight of the poor, the plight of the needy, has haunted every culture in every generation. Ancient civilizations ordained charity through religious texts and civil authorities. But far too often the quality of care varied and indifference reigned. Under the English Poor Laws of the 17th century, towns levied taxes to help the needy. But the same laws penalized those deemed too lazy to work. By the 19th century, waves of poor immigrants flooded American cities like New York and Chicago. As the rich got richer, the poor suffered. Violence often erupted. Volunteer workers were overwhelmed and underprepared. It was time for a change. It was the last quarter of the 19th century. Millions of immigrants flooded into American cities looking for work and a better life, but most found only misery and despair. One person concerned about the human suffering was Jane Addams, the daughter of a wealthy Quaker family in Illinois. Her parents had taught her to be useful in society, but her opportunities seemed limited.
Jane Addams is growing up in a society that has fairly prescribed notions of what women should do, particularly educated women. She doesn't want to become a sort of stereotypical woman, and she talked about trying to bridge the gap between the social classes through personal example.
As her friends were settling into motherhood or careers, Addams set off to tour Europe. Moved by what she saw in London, she wrote home,
"The most interesting thing that we have done in London was a visit to the Toynbee Hall in the East End. It is a community of university men who live there, have their recreation, clubs, and society all among the poor people, yet in the same style they would live in their own circle. It is so free from professional doing good, so unaffectedly sincere, and so productive of good results that it seems perfectly ideal."
Returning home, Addams thought that she could find a house in the middle of the Chicago slums where young, college-educated women like herself could adapt the Toynbee Hall idea.
The idea was not that the trouble was the person. The idea was the trouble was the environment, society, the economic conditions.
And what they hoped to do is by actually taking up residence next to the poor, they could become exponents of the social gospel. That in some way or another they could uplift the lives of the poor or the have-nots through example.
The neighborhood that Jane Addams selected was full of dilapidated houses, of garbage-strewn mud streets, of no heating in the winter and no air in the summer, and mother and father and 10 kids living in one room. And in the middle of this slum sat this lovely old brick house.
With community contributions and some of her own money, Addams and her friend Ellen Starr moved into Hull House. but their neighbors were not quite sure of what to make of them.
They couldn't imagine why these women wanted to live there. And so they were very wary of these two women. But Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr set out to be useful in any way that they could and be neighborly. They began by talking to the women and the children. And the first program within a week was a kindergarten, because it became quite clear that the women needed help with daycare. And that was the icebreaker. Very soon there was a club of Italian boys and a club of German boys. And there was German night, where Jane Addams and Ellen Starr try to give the immigrants a sense that Hull House in America respected their culture and their heritage.
As their neighbors flocked to Hull House, Addams had to attract young women and men to become residents and help run the programs.
Residents did not come easily to the settlement. As you can well imagine, the well-educated young women of Chicago were not unwilling to come and volunteer their time during the day, but living all the time in the slum was a different matter. And so it took some time for Jane Addams to build the resident stock. They're this synergistic group of people working together, and they're bright and they're young and they're brash and they're hopeful about the future.
At Hull House, Addams and her colleagues offered classes in sewing, art, English, and citizenship. There were playgrounds and adult education courses.
So it was an effort to make a bridge between the classes and to bring opportunity to everyone.
Addams and her young reformers at Hull House established new ways to serve the community and to address the ills of society, leaving a legacy for generations. The working port of Baltimore was a stark contrast to the genteel comforts of Jane Addams's childhood. Near its waterfront, an orphan named Mary Richmond grew up in one of its working-class neighborhoods.
Mary Richmond's early life was both sad and interesting. Her mother died when she was 4 of tuberculosis, and she was taken to live with her grandmother in a kind of a ramshackle boarding house on the wrong side of town.
Far from gloomy and depressing, life at the boarding house illuminated Richmond's world.
Her grandmother read the political news and the economic news, and she would raise this stuff at the dinner table. Social issues of the time were hotly debated and fought, and Richmond got to put her 2 cents worth in, you know, and it was a respected 2 cents worth. So early on, she was really trained to think critically and analytically.
She graduated from high school at 16, but with college out of the question, factory work was her only option.
Can you imagine this brilliant, brilliant girl who loved to write, loved to read, loved her books, loved school, wanted to be a teacher, but couldn't because she didn't have any political connections, going to work in a factory?
Richmond managed to find office work, but cruel working and living conditions ruined her health. Eventually, with the help of friends, she found a job at the Baltimore Charity Organization Society.
The idea behind the charity organization societies was trying to coordinate a variety of private relief activities that had been going on in urban America.
So, and here she's about 28 years old. And what she's noticing is that there doesn't seem to be any system or any rhythm to their work. She says if they get a good solution, they just blunder into it. There has to be a better way. And remember, the Charity Organization Society is part of the idea of scientific charity. So let's apply scientific principles. Let's gather data. Let's form hypotheses. Let's see what works.
This was the beginning of professional casework. Richmond had found her calling.
So she wrote a paper that she presented at the National Conference of Charity and Correction talking about the need for a training school. And by 1898, we have the first summer school, the first training at the New York School at Columbia University.
Here was Richmond, with no college degree, teaching, presenting papers around the country, and gathering data on the causes behind society's ills. Her work led to an appointment at the prestigious Russell Sage Foundation in New York, where she completed her influential book, Social Diagnosis.
Social Diagnosis was an important textbook. It had forms that could be used to try to assess the circumstances that people were living in that needed aid and assistance. This is the beginning, really, of what I would call scientific social casework. And that's what's so important about the legacy of the Charity Organization Society in Mary Richmond.
In my mind, the major contribution Mary Richmond made to social work was to explain very carefully that you have to have an understanding of the individual circumstances of people. You have to do good casework because that's the basis on which social reform rests. She saw social work as an integrated process of casework and social reform, a seamless garment.
America's bustling industrial cities drew not only European immigrants, but African Americans fleeing the poverty of the rural South. Unlike their white counterparts, black workers had to contend with segregation.
When the migration north began, African Americans who were already in the North, some of them social workers, were concerned about helping African Americans fit into society instead of helping society accommodate other people.
While the settlement house movement did acknowledge the existence of an African American population, the settlement movement focused on immigrants. The African American community was virtually invisible. When they were visible, they were relegated to at least secondary status.
African Americans needed social services, but few blacks could get the necessary professional training.
We're talking about formal education. For the most part, social work education was largely white and upper middle class or upper class individuals.
African American social work and social welfare developed parallel to what was going on in the majority culture. African American students were trained to work in African American settlement houses, and that was accepted as the normal practice.
Into this segregated world was born Edward Franklin Frazier, a brilliant student from a black Baltimore family of doctors and teachers. As a young man, he chafed at America's ideas of racial superiority, and he determined to fight them.
E. Franklin Frazier came with a perspective that said manhood and citizenship meant that I will not abide by the rules of segregation.
Graduating with honors from Howard University and armed with a master's in sociology from Clark University in Massachusetts, Frazier accepted a research fellowship in 1921 from the New York School of Social Work to study rural cooperatives in Denmark. It was small-scale socialism and possibly useful to rural blacks in the South.
The conditions that people lived under were awful. And it wasn't simply because of segregation, but it was also because of such dire poverty. Many were sharecroppers on the land, dependent upon wealthier farmers to provide for family needs and so forth.
For blacks in the 20s, the American South was the place to flee, a place of rising Klan membership, lynchings, and grinding black poverty. But it beckoned Frazier. He accepted a professorship at the Atlanta School of Social Work, where blacks could get formal training. Within a year, he became its director.
He had this idealistic belief that there was a readiness for change. that social work had kind of planted inside of him that this was possible. So let me go and practice and make this possible. He wanted the School of Social Work in Atlanta to be a beacon and a model that people could be proud of. He did well in terms of promoting the school, getting it up and running.
Dr. Frazier accomplished so much in the short time he lived because he worked day and night, and he didn't have time to socialize. And I think maybe sometimes he resented it because he suddenly spoke about it quite often, that the fact that people were not working hard.
Traveling across the South to recruit students and encourage support for the school, Frazier refused to accept segregation.
He would go to meetings and refuse to stay and say to people, I told you I will not sit in a segregated meeting with you, and he would walk out. Well, in that time, that was like the worst thing for somebody to do.
The entire history of the Negro in the United States has been to create in the Negro a feeling of racial inferiority. Segregation was established which stigmatized the Negro as unfit for human association, morally degenerate, and intellectually incapable of being educated.
Criticized for being too militant, he was forced to resign from the school he had nurtured. Eventually, he moved to Washington, D.C., where he taught sociology and helped to found a school of social work at Howard University. Over the years, a cadre of able black social workers were professionally trained at Atlanta and Howard. These schools stand today as a fitting legacy to the man and the profession he fostered.
Once I built the railroad, I made it run. I made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime?
As the Great Depression gripped the nation, the fledgling profession of social work faced its greatest challenge.
I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished.
I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't elected Roosevelt president, because he inspired us again with the feeling that somebody was doing something about it. And he overcame this business that the government should not intervene. The government should intervene. It was the government's responsibility that people should not die of hunger.
President Franklin Roosevelt promised Americans a New Deal, and for the first time brought in professionally educated social workers to fulfill the promise. 3 stood out: Frances Perkins, Secretary of Labor; Jane Hoey, Director of the Federal Bureau of Public Assistance; and Harry Hopkins. The son of an Iowa harness maker, Hopkins majored in political science at Grinnell College.
Grinnell College was one of the Middle Western bastions of the social gospel movement, which believed that persons had a religious obligation to help their fellow man. Harry went to New York. When he got there, he took up the Grinnell calling to become a social worker, to do something for the good of others. And he found urban poverty of a scale and of an impenetrable quality that he had not been accustomed to in the Middle West. And it made him, I think, serious in his thinking about the challenges of his profession and the kind of dedication that was required in order to succeed in it.
Hopkins spent 20 years in New York, gaining recognition as an innovative social worker during the time that the profession was developing. Seeking leadership for New York's daring work relief project, Governor Roosevelt had tapped Hopkins, establishing a lifelong relationship.
Persons who observed the scene, however, in 1933, saw in Hopkins those qualities which were going to distinguish him later on.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
As director of the new independent Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the FERA, Hopkins went right to work.
President Roosevelt has given me the job of administering the $500 million appropriated by Congress under the Emergency Relief Act of 1933 to help care for the 18 million persons whom the Depression has plunged from self-support to public dependency.
On Capitol Hill, critics attacked Hopkins' relief program, calling it a quick fix and a poor investment in the long run. Hopkins responded, "People don't eat in the long run, Senator. They eat every day."
First couple of weeks he was there, he stayed with me in a little apartment that I had, and we had a lot of fun together. And he made this remark that I quoted to you that I've never forgotten. "Bob, I'm going to do exactly as I please, and I probably won't last more than 6 months."
I think that Roosevelt saw Hopkins' energy, imagination, his willingness to take risks, his willingness to stand up to powerful politicians.
On the question of a work program as against direct relief, it is my conviction, and one of the strongest convictions I hold, that the federal government should never return to a direct relief program. We should reach a concept in America where the able-bodied unemployed are entitled to a job as a matter of right.
The Works Progress Administration was launched late in 1935 as the key agency in the federal work program to employ able people from relief roles.
By 1935, Hopkins was overseeing the largest federally funded work program the nation had ever known.
Hopkins insisted on doing all he could for the little guy who was out of work. In fact, he made it a point to say, "You're jumping all over me because I've spent all this money on relief. If I deserve any criticism, words to this effect, it is that I didn't do enough when I had the chance."
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 millions of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health.
With the help of Harry Hopkins and Labor Secretary Francis Perkins, President Roosevelt put the Social Security Act of 1935 into effect. New Deal economist Wilbur Cohen remembers.
In my opinion, the Social Security Act, whatever its limitations are, was the most important long-range change in social policy in the United States of that period.
But to run these programs, men and women trained in social work and committed to social justice had to be accepted in Washington.
It was a battle to get the notion accepted that trained people who'd been selected for this particular work were the best people to work in public welfare, to work with poor folks.
The person who saw the need to bring professionals into the system was Jane Hoey, director of the Federal Bureau of Public Assistance under the new Social Security Administration.
Jane Hoey worked with Harry Hopkins in New York in the American Red Cross. She was a trained social worker. She is a rather unsung heroine, I think, of social work. We very often don't think of the context. We don't go back to what public welfare meant in the early 30s. There was no federal help at that point for poor women and their kids. So you have to picture one woman with 3 staff people in an office in Washington who has to create the whole public assistance system from scratch.
She insisted that her agency be staffed by experienced social workers who could effectively administer the federal grants for state aid to the aged, to the blind, and to dependent children.
And you know, this had been really a state level and a county level operation. This was a big area for patronage for governors and other officials who would hire, legislators' wives or whatever.
To accomplish her goals, she could twist some powerful arms.
She was sitting in a governor's office talking with him about something that he really needed to do for public welfare in his state, and he calls Washington and talks to somebody in Social Security office and says, I have this red-haired devil sitting in my office and she's telling me what I have to do. I don't have to do what she says, do I? And the answer came back, oh yeah, you better think about that.
Hoey's fiery personality had put her in direct conflict with many powerful figures. But with her strong convictions and spirit, she endowed the Federal Bureau of Public Assistance with the highest standards of professional service.